The room was silent, save for the sound of shallow breathing and the slow drip of an IV bag. Michael sat beside his father's hospital bed, the weight of decades resting on his shoulders. His father's once imposing frame now lay shrunken beneath white sheets, skin translucent, voice a frail whisper. "Michael," the old man said, "I never wanted to leave, but I did. And it ruined you." A single tear traced a line down Michael's cheek. Years of therapy, rage, and loneliness collapsed in an instant of raw truth. His childhood had been a symphony of absence, missed birthdays, broken promises, echoes of footsteps that never came. Now, with death looming, the man he hated offered something dangerously close to love. Michael couldn't breathe. The betrayal that sculpted him into the guarded, stoic man he'd become had a voice now. "I see you," his father whispered. "You were always more than I ever was." And then, with a final exhale, silence. Just silence. Michael didn't cry. Not then. Not even as the nurses stepped quietly into the room and began disconnecting the machines. He stood slowly, mechanical, like a man underwater. The sterile world around him was too bright, too quiet, too clean. He looked down at his father's body, empty now, like an old coat someone forgot to take home. Somewhere inside, something cracked, not loud but seismic. He walked out without saying a word. No calls were made. No family gathered. Just the soft hiss of automatic doors behind him. Outside, the wind bit at his cheeks. He stared into the night sky, looking for an answer that wouldn't come. The weight of what wasn't said pressed against his ribs, thick and suffocating. In that moment, Michael knew this wasn't just the death of his father. It was the death of the version of himself who'd waited for apologies. He had come for closure. Instead, he found the beginning of an ache that would never fully go away. He sat in his car for over an hour, engine off, hands on the steering wheel. The world moved around him. Nurses changed shifts, cars came and went, but inside the cabin, time stood still. Michael stared straight ahead, vision unfocused. His father's final words looped in his mind. "You were always more than I ever was." A bitter laugh rose and died in his throat. Why say that now? Why not 20 years ago when it could have changed something? The dashboard clock ticked on, uncaring. His phone buzzed once, then again. Text from a life he didn't feel ready to return to. Grief didn't crash into him like he'd expected. It seeped in, slow and invisible, wrapping around his lungs, dulling every nerve. He wasn't sure if he felt sadness or numbness. Maybe they were the same. Eventually he turned the key and pulled away from the hospital, leaving behind the ghost of a man he never truly knew. At home, the silence was louder. The apartment greeted him like a tomb. Unwashed dishes, an overwatered plant, unread books stacked on the table. Michael sat on the edge of his couch, staring at the wall. He tried to summon tears. Nothing came. Grief had stolen even that release. Instead, he scrolled through old photos on his phone, some of friends, some of landscapes, none of his father. There were no memories to anchor. No birthday cards. No hugs at graduations. Just fragments of a man who existed like a shadow behind a curtain. The only picture he had was from a grainy childhood Polaroid, him holding a stick in the yard, his father blurry in the background. That was it. A presence that was never present. He threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall and fell silently to the floor. Still no tears. Just that same awful emptiness echoing in the hollows of his chest. Later that night he opened a closet he hadn't touched in years. It smelled of cedar and forgotten seasons. Inside was a single box, labeled Michael, 1987. His heart skipped. Slowly, carefully, he pulled it down and set it on the table. Inside were drawings, school report cards, a plastic toy samurai, and a letter. He unfolded the letter with shaking fingers. His father's handwriting, messy and uneven, filled the page. "I wanted to be better. I didn't know how. You deserved better. I'm sorry." Michael pressed the paper to his chest. The ache flared like a match in dry grass. Not because the words healed him, but because they came too late. Regret is a strange inheritance. It doesn't comfort. It lingers. As he sat there surrounded by relics of his younger self, he realized something devastating. The man he needed his father to be had only just arrived, after he was already gone. Michael stood in front of the mirror, the letter still folded in his pocket like a wound he couldn't stop touching. The face that looked back at him was weary, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying a history of silence. He studied his features, the lines on his forehead, the darkness beneath his eyes, the resemblance to the man who left. For the first time he whispered, "Who am I without his absence?" His life had been built around that vacuum. He became strong because no one carried him. He became quiet because no one listened. The man in the mirror wasn't broken, but he was shaped by ache. He saw flashes of himself as a child, always watching the door, always hoping for footsteps that never came. A part of him still waited, even now. He laughed bitterly. His father had left once in the body, and 1,000 times in memory. And yet, here he stood, made of everything that hurt him, and somehow still standing. He went for a walk, not knowing where his feet were taking him. The morning air was cold, biting at his skin like a reminder to stay present. Children played on a distant field, their laughter sharp in the quiet. Michael paused at the edge of a park bench watching them. He remembered being that small, that full of want. A boy with scraped knees and a heart that didn't understand why his father never showed. He watched one boy fall. Another helped him up, laughing, brushing off his knees. That simple gesture twisted something in Michael's gut. It was so easy, for them. Connection, kindness. What had been easy for others had been unreachable for him. A part of him mourned the child he had been, the one who learned too early how to protect himself, how to need no one. That child still lived inside him. And today, for the first time, he saw him clearly. That night, Michael pulled out an old journal he hadn't touched in over a decade. The pages were yellowed, the spine cracked, the ink faded. It was filled with pieces of a boy trying to explain why he wasn't enough. Drawings of monsters labeled Dad's anger, poems with no rhymes, scribbles of words like why alone, invisible. He ran his fingers across the jagged lines. Each word was a breadcrumb back to the person he used to be. The pain was there, still raw, still echoing. But now he saw something else too, resilience. He had survived without knowing how. He hadn't been abandoned because he was unworthy. He had been abandoned because someone else didn't know how to stay. He closed the journal and held it to his chest. For the first time he didn't want to forget. He wanted to remember, because buried in those scribbles was the boy who never stopped hoping. He dreamt of a river that night, a wide, endless stream under a black sky. In the dream, Michael stood on the bank, holding the hand of his younger self. The boy didn't speak, only looked up with wide, wounded eyes. Across the river, his father stood in the mist, unreachable. Michael called out, but the wind stole his voice. The boy tugged his hand. "He won't come," he whispered. "But we can go." Michael hesitated, then knelt, face to face with the child version of himself. "I see you now," he said. "You don't have to wait anymore." They turned from the river, walking into the dark together. When Michael awoke, his pillow was damp with tears he didn't remember shedding. The dream wasn't a message. It was a reckoning. The waiting was over. He no longer needed the man who left to come back. He needed to walk forward with the boy who stayed. Michael woke before dawn, the city still sleeping. He sat on the balcony wrapped in a blanket, holding a cup of steaming tea. The journal rested beside him. The letter from his father was folded neatly inside. His breath made clouds in the cold air. The ache in his chest hadn't vanished, but it had softened. It no longer screamed. It pulsed quietly, like a bruise fading. He didn't know what healing looked like, but this felt like a beginning. He wasn't whole, but he wasn't broken either. He thought about the boy in the dream, the journal, the river. Maybe Zen wasn't about erasing pain but about witnessing it, without judgment, without fear. As the first light bled across the skyline, Michael whispered, "I'm still here." Not to anyone else, just to himself. And in that whisper was something sacred, a promise to the boy who waited, and to the man who finally came home. Michael returned to work a week later. The world hadn't paused for his grief. Meetings were held, deadlines assigned, coffee brewed like nothing had changed. But something had. He found himself zoning out mid-conversation, staring through spreadsheets, hearing his father's voice in the back of his mind. The dissonance grew louder each day. One afternoon, in a meeting about budgets, someone joked, "Michael, you look like a ghost." Laughter followed. Michael smiled politely, but inside, a quiet fury stirred. Not at them, but at himself. At how effortlessly he'd slid back into pretending. He wanted to scream, "My father died. He told me too late that he loved me. I don't care about your numbers." But he didn't. He nodded, made notes, stayed late. And when he got home that night, he stared at the ceiling, wondering what part of him had ever believed being numb was the same as being strong. That night, Michael opened a voice note on his phone and began to record, not for anyone, just to let the noise out. "I feel like I'm living someone else's life," he said. "I go to work, I answer emails, but inside, I'm screaming." His voice cracked. "Everyone thinks I've moved on. I haven't even started." He paused, breath heavy. "He told me he loved me, and then he died. And now I'm supposed to just, what? Be grateful? Forgive him?" Silence. Then softer. "I don't know who I am without the anger. It held me together for so long." The recording ended. He didn't play it back. He didn't save it. He just sat there, phone on his lap, body shaking. The grief wasn't linear. It was a storm. A war between the child who still felt abandoned and the man trying to move on. And in that war, there were no victors. Only echoes. He started avoiding friends. Texts went unanswered. Calls ignored. When they asked if he was okay, he typed, "just tired," and left it at that. The truth felt too jagged to explain. One night he opened his group chat, watching messages roll in, memes, dinner plans, gossip charity. His thumb hovered over the reply bar. But nothing he had to say belonged there. The conversations felt like a different language. He was sinking while everyone else floated. Eventually, he silenced the thread. Not out of resentment, but to protect his unraveling. Healing, he was learning, was a lonely process. Not because people didn't care, but because no one could sit in the fire for him. They could wait outside. But this was his burning. His solitude was no longer a prison. It was a crucible. And somewhere inside the flame, a new version of him was slowly taking shape. One morning, he looked at an old photo. His 10th birthday. A cake. A crooked smile. A boy trying hard to seem happy. His father wasn't in the frame. He never was. Michael stared at the image for a long time. Then, on impulse, he put it in a frame and set it on the kitchen table. It felt strange at first, honoring a version of himself he'd long buried. But each morning, he poured coffee and nodded at that boy like a silent ritual. "I see you. I'm still here." And in doing so, something softened. That child had survived heartbreak and silence, and still found ways to laugh. He had been strong long before Michael ever claimed the word. Michael didn't pity him anymore. He admired him. The boy didn't need saving. He needed remembering. And now, he was no longer a ghost. He was family. And finally, he had a seat at the table. One evening, the storm inside erupted. No trigger. No warning. Just a moment when all the noise inside Michael became unbearable. He collapsed to the floor, fists clenched, a choked scream torn from his chest. Not rage. Release. Years of holding it together came undone in one shattering wave. He didn't try to stop it. He let the sobs come, deep, guttural, unstoppable. He clawed at the floor like he was trying to hold on to something real. The grief wasn't poetic. It was raw and ugly and human and necessary. After what felt like hours, he lay still, face wet, body spent. The silence that followed was unlike any before. Not empty, cleansed, like a room aired after a storm. He hadn't broken. He had broken open, and in the shards he saw something shimmering. Not an answer, but space. To feel, to rebuild, to begin again. A week later, Michael visited his aunt, his father's only surviving sibling. The living room smelled of lavender and old wood. She was frail but sharp, her eyes piercing through time. Over tea, she handed him a small wooden box. "He left this for you years ago," she said. "He never had the courage to send it." Inside were cassette tapes dated from the late 90s. Michael stared at them, heart thudding. That was the year he'd turned 12, the year his father vanished for good. That night, he borrowed a friend's old tape player. He pressed play. Static. Then a voice, trembling and raw. "Michael, I don't know where to begin. I want to be someone you can forgive. But I don't deserve it. Not yet." Michael clutched the player like a lifeline. It wasn't just a voice. It was a man unraveling. His father, broken and afraid. And suddenly, the story Michael had always told himself started to crack. The tapes became a ritual. Every night, Michael listened, his father speaking in pieces, sometimes drunk, sometimes lucid, always remorseful. One recording was different. "The night I left, I sat in the driveway for 3 hours. I watched you brush your teeth through the bathroom window. You were humming." Michael froze. That night had haunted him. His father had simply disappeared. But now, this image, his father sitting just outside, too paralyzed to walk in. "I didn't leave because I didn't love you," the tape continued. "I left because I didn't know how to love you the way you needed, and I was afraid you'd see me for what I was." Michael pressed pause, breath shaking. It wasn't a justification, but it was something real. The monster in his memory was becoming human. And in that humanity, the pain deepened, not because it excused anything, but because it proved his father had wanted to stay, and still couldn't. Michael visited his childhood home the next morning. It was still there, repainted and smaller than he remembered. The new owners allowed him 10 minutes inside. He walked through each room like a ghost, retracing its steps. In the corner of the garage, he found something unexpected, a stack of worn-out canvases. His father had been a painter once, before life and disappointment wore him down. On one canvas was a portrait, unfinished. A boy's face. Michael's face. Rough brushstrokes captured his eyes perfectly, full of hope and fear. He stared at it, throat tightening. It had been hidden in this garage for decades, gathering dust like a secret confession. His father had tried, in silence, in shadows. The man had spoken through art when words failed. And now Michael could feel it more than hear it. The aching love that was always there, clumsy and buried, but real. Later that day, Michael sat by a lake they used to visit, a place from vague childhood memories. The wind danced on the water's surface. Ducks drifted near the shore. He held the last cassette. As it played, the voice cracked. "If you're hearing this, maybe I'm already gone. I don't deserve peace, but I hope you find yours. You are better than the worst parts of me. You always were." Michael's hand trembled. He stood, walked to the water's edge, and pressed stop. Then he placed the cassette gently into the lake. It floated briefly, then sank. The weight of his father's failures, of expectations unmet, sank with it. Final goodbye, not to the man, but to the story Michael had told himself, that he was unworthy, unloved. The truth was messier, more painful, but more honest. And in its ache, it held the seed of release. That evening Michael wrote for hours. He filled pages, letters not to his father but to himself. He wrote to the boy who waited by the window, to the teenager who pretended not to care, to the man who still checked the door some nights without realizing it. He apologized. He forgave. He promised to show up from now on, not for the man who left, but for the one who stayed. The one who survived. As the final words spilled onto the page, something lifted. He didn't need to rewrite his past. He just needed to understand it. And through that understanding, begin again. The pain wouldn't vanish, but it no longer owned him. He folded the pages, placed them in an envelope, and tucked them into the same box that had once held his father's letter. A box of 2 generations, one learning to leave, the other learning to stay. Michael stood in front of the meditation center's entrance, his hand resting on the weathered wood of the door. Inside was a space he'd avoided for years. Silence scared him, because it left him alone with himself. But something had shifted. He wasn't looking for peace now. He was seeking truth. As he entered, a wave of calm washed over him. Candles flickered along the walls. Cushions lined the floor. An old monk nodded to him but said nothing. Michael sat, cross-legged, breath trembling. For the first few minutes, his mind screamed, memories, doubts, grief, judgments. But slowly, a deeper silence emerged. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of awareness. For the first time, he saw his thoughts like passing clouds, not truths, just weather. His pain wasn't gone, but it wasn't him. In the stillness a voice rose, not his father's, not a ghost, his own. Clear. Chengwer. Grounded. I am still becoming, it said. And that is enough. After meditation, Michael walked into the garden behind the center. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and stone paths wove between moss-covered rocks. He paused near a koi pond, watching the slow dance of the fish beneath the surface. He remembered the therapist once telling him, "Your mind isn't broken, it's just busy." That had felt false then. Now, it made sense. His mind was no longer a battlefield. It was a place of weather. Sometimes storms. Sometimes sun. Always passing. He took off his shoes and stepped barefoot into the grass. The earth was cold and damp, grounding. A breeze brushed past him like a blessing. He whispered, "I forgive you." He didn't say who it was for, his father, himself, the universe. Maybe all 3. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about unbinding. Letting go not to erase, but to live forward. The weight he had worn for decades finally began to loosen. That evening, Michael found himself journaling again. But this time it wasn't pain he was tracing, it was gratitude. Not the performative kind, but something deeper. He wrote about small things, the sound of the wind in the trees, the warmth of tea between cold hands, the courage to come home to himself. He realized that healing didn't mean never hurting again. It meant choosing to meet the pain differently. Not with resistance, but with softness. He thought about the many versions of himself. The boy who waited, the man who ran, the soul who finally stayed. All of them deserved love. All of them deserved to breathe. He closed the journal and smiled, not from joy, but from recognition. He had never been broken, just buried. Beneath layers of silence, expectation, and fear, he had always been whole. He just needed to remember. Later that night, Michael looked in the mirror again. But this time, he didn't search for what was missing. He simply looked. His eyes met his own, steady. The face was the same, but the gaze had changed. Less guarded. More curious. He reached up and touched the scar above his brow, a childhood injury from a fall no one had seen. It had hurt then, but now, it was part of the map. He wasn't erasing history. He was learning to read it differently. The boy who never felt seen was now the man who could see himself. He said aloud, "I'm proud of you." No one else heard, but it didn't matter. It wasn't for applause. It was a ceremony of self. A quiet crowning. A return. In that dim reflection, Michael didn't just recognize himself, he honored him. The wound was still there, but it was no longer the only thing he saw. The next morning, Michael returned to the lake. This time not to release, but to sit. To witness. The same place where he had let go of the cassette now felt different. Not sacred, not haunted, just real. He breathed in the crisp air, watching ducks skim across the surface. A child passed by, laughing, chasing a paper boat. Michael smiled. No ache, just warmth. He sat on the bench and closed his eyes. In the silence, he didn't think of his father. He thought of his breath, of how he was still here, of how everything he needed had always been inside him, not in some future perfection, but in the present imperfection. He was not a wound walking. He was a soul returning. The pain, the loss, the longing, they were part of the path. But they were not the destination. And in that moment, sitting still beneath a quiet sky, Michael felt something rare and true. Peace. Michael started painting again. Not for anyone else, and not to become something. Just to feel the texture of colors. The brush in his hand felt like an old friend he had forgotten to miss. Each stroke across the canvas wasn't trying to create beauty, it was honoring presence. A tree, a sky, a memory. He didn't plan what to paint. He followed feeling. For hours he moved with no urgency. At one point, he stepped back and looked. The canvas was chaotic and gentle. He realized it looked like his heart, raw, unfinished, alive. He laughed softly. For the first time, it was enough. He no longer needed to be understood by others. He had become his own witness. The boy who had begged to be seen had grown into a man who now saw himself. Not in the mirror, but in the making, in the moment, in the messy, silent art of simply existing. He visited his mother's grave that afternoon. It had been years. The cemetery was quiet, except for the rustle of wind through dry leaves. He knelt beside her stone, brushing off the dust. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," he whispered. "I think I was angry you didn't protect me. But maybe you were just trying to survive too." The wind picked up, rustling the trees. He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't need to hear anything back. He just wanted to speak the truth out loud. "I've been carrying everyone's pain for so long," he said. "Today, I'm putting some of it down." He placed a single lily on the stone. No grand goodbye. Just a quiet offering. He stood slowly, heart heavy, but honest. His grief hadn't vanished. It had transformed. It was no longer a chain. It was a thread. And now, he knew which parts he could let go, and which he would carry, gently. Later, he met an old friend for coffee. They hadn't spoken deeply in years. She asked, "How have you been, really?" He paused, then smiled. "Becoming." She raised an eyebrow. He laughed. "It's not a fixed thing. Healing, I mean. Some days I'm still that boy. Other days, I'm the man who paints." She nodded slowly. "That makes sense." Their conversation wandered, from music to loss to what it meant to start again. For the first time, he didn't try to impress or hide. He didn't shrink or perform. He simply existed, soft and honest. And she met him there. No fixing. Just presence. As they parted, she hugged him longer than usual. He let her. In that embrace, there was no need for words. Just warmth. Just the quiet miracle of being seen and accepted, exactly as he was. No masks. No explanations. Just Michael. Finally enough, even when unfinished. That night, he took a long walk through the city. Street lights blinked on one by one. The world hummed its usual tune, cars, laughter, distant music. But inside him, there was a stillness. Not emptiness, just space. Room to feel. Room to breathe. He passed places that once made him ache. The park bench, the bookstore, the bridge. Each held memory. but they no longer ruled him. He paused at the bridge, leaning against the rail. Below, the water moved steadily, indifferent, eternal. "Thank you," he whispered. To the hurt. To the boy. To the father. To himself. It wasn't closure. It was acknowledgement. He turned and walked on, not toward anything specific, just forward. That was enough. He didn't know where the road led, but he trusted his steps now. The world hadn't changed, but he had. And in that quiet revelation, the night shimmered with the beauty of simply continuing. The next morning, he sat with his journal one last time. This time, he didn't write about pain. He wrote about truth. About the long road to forgiveness. About how healing doesn't happen when someone else changes. It begins when we stop waiting. He ended the entry with a simple line. "I am already whole." He closed the journal, placed it beside his father's letter and the old tapes, and gently sealed the box shut. Not to forget, but to protect what he'd learned. He placed the box on the highest shelf of his closet, not hidden, not forgotten, honored. Like an altar to survival, a shrine to growth. As sunlight broke through the curtains and landed on his face, he exhaled deeply. This wasn't the end of the story, but it was the end of the ache that started it. The war inside him had quieted. In its place now, stillness, clarity, and self. Weeks passed. Then, months. Life moved. Grocery lists, traffic lights, half-finished emails. But Michael noticed things he'd never noticed before. The way the barista smiled when handing him his coffee. The golden tint of dusk on old buildings. The softness in his own breath. He wasn't chasing meaning anymore. He was living inside it. The story of his father didn't vanish. It became quieter, less sharp. Sometimes, he still woke up, aching. But now, he met that ache like an old friend. He no longer needed to be healed to be whole. He'd learned to let pain walk beside him without letting it define the path. And in this slow return to presence, he discovered something remarkable. The extraordinary wasn't in moments of triumph. It was in ordinary grace. In peeling an orange. In folding laundry. In the whisper of wind through the trees. This was it. Not the ending. The becoming. He started teaching art again. Small community classes at the local rec center. It wasn't about skill. It was about permission. Letting people feel without needing to explain. In one session, a teenage girl painted a storm, loud, purple, violent. When she looked ashamed, Michael smiled and said, "Beautiful." Her eyes widened. "But it's a mess." He nodded. "So is healing." The room fell silent. Then she smiled back, relieved. Michael wasn't teaching them to draw. He was teaching them to feel, to trust their hands, to honor what spilled out. In those quiet rooms, something passed between them. Not instruction, but presence. No one needed fixing. They needed freedom. And every time someone dared to create from the gut instead of the head, Michael saw his younger self in them. And this time, the boy was not alone. He had become the one he once needed. One Sunday, Michael visited the river again. Not to mourn. Not to release. Just to be. He brought no journal, no letter, no tape. Only his breath. The river moved as it always had, indifferent to sorrow, to memory. He sat cross-legged on the grass, the sound of rushing water weaving through his silence. A child nearby laughed. A dog barked. Life didn't pause for his healing. And it didn't need to. That was the lesson Zen had been whispering all along. Enlightenment wasn't a peak to reach. It was this. Right here. A man, sitting by a river, breathing. Not trying to become. Just being. A leaf drifted by on the surface. Michael followed it with his eyes. Then, let it go. He smiled. Eyes closed, hand over his chest. Everything he'd been chasing had always been inside him. Buried, yes. But never broken. And now, finally, remembered. In a dream that night, Michael returned to the riverbank. The boy was there again, same wide eyes, same silence. But this time Michael knelt down and opened his arms. The boy hesitated, then stepped in. They embraced. No words, just the warmth of return. When Michael pulled back, the boy smiled, not the smile of a child seeking approval, but of one finally seen. Then he faded, not vanishing, but integrating, dissolving into Michael's chest like light into water. Michael awoke with tears on his face. Not grief. Completion. The dream hadn't given him closure. It had given him reunion. The boy was no longer alone. He was part of the man. Whole, not despite the wounds, but with them. He whispered into the dark. You waited so long. I'm here now. And in that whisper, generations of silence broke like dawn. Morning came slowly, gently. Michael stood on his balcony, watching the sky shift from indigo to gold. A new day. Just another. But it felt sacred. He sipped tea, one hand resting on the balcony rail, the other on his heart. The world buzzed below, cars, conversations, dogs barking. But within him, stillness. Presence. Tea too. No urgency to solve, to win, to prove. Just breath. Just being. And the Zen master had said, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Michael smiled. He had not escaped his life. He had returned to it. And this time, he brought all of himself. The boy, oneself. The man. The art, the ache. All of it. All welcome. All worthy. And as the sun rose fully and warmed his face, he whispered a single final line. Not to the sky, not to anyone else, but to the still, small truth within.